Welcome to Horror Makes Us Happy, the podcast where we ask the question, what is it about horror that makes us happy? Your hosts are Steve Becker and myself, Chris Whitman, and you can find out more about us and listen to all the fun recordings at horrormakesushappy.com. Before we get started, a little information for you and the listeners. These are your trigger warnings. We're going to be talking about horror movies, horror culture, dark, macabre things, which could involve anything from murder, rape, suicide, child abuse, graphic language, and or violence will ensue. So if that's not your thing, take a seat out. If that is your thing, take a seat, grab some popcorn, and listen to fucked up things.
Like that.
Like that. And if you're one of our Patreon subscribers, you may or may not have heard me say cunt, I think 4 times before the trigger warning, this recording. Yeah, that's a record. Before we get started, next up on the lineup is going to be Billy Pon, writer, director, and producer best known for Circus of the Dead, Cowboys from Hell, and Dollboy. This week, we have the pleasure of having with us Karim Hussain, cinematographer and director of photography, best known for such works as Hobo with a Shotgun, Possessor, and Antiviral. That was the other one, yes.
Oh, Viral, sorry.
Welcome, Karim. Glad to have you. How you doing
Great.
today?
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So in this interview, we're going to be going through 3 phases, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, coming at you with the same series of questions.
The idea is that, sometimes coming at it from multiple angles triggers memories that you'd forgotten.
Sure.
But we skipped the spot where you can plug stuff. So do you want to plug whatever it is you're working on now?
Well, working on a few things. Some of them I can't really talk about, but probably the latest film I had that has come out recently is Possessor, the Brandon Cronenberg film. And also I have Simon Barrett's slasher picture Seance, which is going to be coming out, I think, in May on Shudder and in cinemas through RLJ. So on those films, I'm the director of photography.
Nice. And may I say, your rig is quite impressive on your picture on IMDb.
It is the easy rig as well. That was shot in the Jordanian desert. That's still on a war picture that I shot a few years ago. So yeah, back when I was operating the camera, I don't operate the camera so much anymore. Just because on certain pictures, you're actually not allowed, if you're the director of photography, to operate the camera. But the good news is I have excellent camera operators who can do the stuff. So that's how it goes.
Nice.
Always good to have.
So I skipped one part. This obviously isn't meant to be a therapy session. So if there's any questions you want to skip, just say so and we'll move on. But starting with childhood, what are some of your earliest memories of scary things?
Well, I started very, very, very young. I've always been attracted to the horror genre, always been obsessed with it. And, coming in the family I had, which is a mixed race family in Ottawa, Canada. So it's the capital of Canada. It's a very conservative town. So when growing up in that sort of conservative environment, you gravitate towards marginal things if conformity isn't particularly interesting to you. So very young, I was always different. It's like my name was one thing. I was in a pretty white area. My mother is French Quebecois and my father is from Pakistan. So already that was quite a culture shock in the environment I was around. You were a bit different. I mean, it was a bit multicultural, but certainly not like it would be today. So you always had the sense that you were different. Something was different about you. So that automatically made me gravitate more towards genre pictures. I mean, when I was young, certainly pictures like King Kong, the original RKO King Kong were huge influences on me. And I saw them very, very young. We had, again, the Saturday morning horror host television shows that we had when I was young. And this is going back to the 70s here. But it was called Spooktacular, and we would watch all of these great Universal horror pictures, even something like the Edgar Ulmer The Black Cat, which was the first movie that I saw that had very visible sort of sadism in it, which was quite something as a child to see something so intense and so surreal and out there. So that was quite a big influence upon me. I would say The Black Cat was something that really kind of blew me away very young. And then as things went on from early childhood, I was definitely getting more into Hammer pictures. I was definitely into the Hammer Draculas, the Frankenstein, as that went on and everything. So, I got into the more sort of graphic color goth stuff later, but I really started off pretty heavily into the Universal stuff. Although one of my earliest memories is probably watching a Christopher Lee Dracula. I think it may have been actually a censored TV print of Scars of Dracula, if I'm not mistaken. So that was pretty early on that I saw that. But I've always been attracted to the horror genre. My mother, who's wonderful, was always into horror movies, and my grandmother was really, really into horror movies. So we would watch them sort of together as a family. And it was a very, very conservative environment. So horror was just a way to almost have friends. I wasn't, somebody who had a lot of friends when I was a kid. I had a few, but I wasn't that social a child. I was much more into an internal world. So,
when you say it was a way to have friends, what do you mean by that?
My friends were, Frankenstein's monster. My friends were the Wolfman. Okay. My friends were, like those King Kong. Like those were the friends that I related to more than a lot of human people. In a sense, certainly when I was very young, Edgar Allan Poe, was an absolutely massive influence in terms of the writing and everything. And back then, I mean, you read these Stephen King novels now, and they're actually quite graphic. But as a kid, I would read them and totally love them and enjoy them. So Stephen King was a big thing too. Probably preteen is when I started reading Stephen King.
Lots of stuff there already in childhood. Although with having a mother and grandmother who were horror fans, I mean, that's a big, I don't know, push in the right direction, I guess you could say.
Catalyst.
Yeah, it was wonderful. I mean, it was always a conflict with my father because he, didn't like horror movies. He came from a very conservative background, and I get it. Like, conformity was a big deal for him. In order to be accepted into society, he had to conform to the best he can, while retaining sort of his identity within the Muslim community. But he was always about conform, never stand out, excel, but don't. He was very much into the studious path, and I rebelled against that very, very hardcore. I was a very difficult child because I knew very, very early on that I wanted to make films. I wanted to make movies. I knew at 6. I would start filming stuff with my father's Super 8 camera, Super 8 film back in the day, and doing little short movies and things like that. So I knew very, very young what I wanted to do, which is difficult for a child because all the other children surrounding you are busy being children, whereas you are busy being ambitious with an idea of this kind of thing. So that also is something that sets you apart from the other kids when this is what I'm supposed to do. This is why I was put on this planet to do this.
Do you remember the moment you decided that's what you wanted to do, or learn that that's what you wanted to do?
I mean, it wasn't really a eureka moment. I think it was a very gradual thing. But I think from the minute I saw the Universal movies and was so obsessed with them and everything, that's something that definitely, it was pretty clear on that's what I would be doing.
The reason I ask is because, at least from my own personal experience, and I know my personal experience isn't the same as other people, but that's what makes me curious is, for me, my path in life was very strange in that what I am good at and what I wanted to do, there was no college degree for it when I got out of high school. There were only certificates that you could take to get certified to do something. And my father had pushed me very hard to get a college degree. And so I hadn't even looked at these other opportunities. So I didn't even know they existed. And in a similar vein, I think looking back on my childhood, I don't know how old I was when I realized that making films was a career choice, but I know that it was not at 6 years old, for example. And so that's when I hear people say, "Oh, I knew I wanted to do this for a living." That's one of the first things I think of is, how did you even know that was a choice?
Yeah, I mean, you obviously books, and the odd making of show that would come on, because back then in the 70s and early 80s, you would occasionally get sort of like a making of episodes coming up, but there was a lot of mystery to it. But I was always fascinated by it. But when I was very young, I got a book, and it was weird. It was a children's book about the making of the Hammer picture To the Devil a Daughter, which of course it took me a number of years to actually be able to see the movie. And for those who have seen it know that there's certain elements of that movie that make it that it's surprising it's still even in active distribution today. It was a really interesting book that really went down to the nitty gritty of all of the elements of production into a movie, including budgets, as to what crew members did what, and everything. So strangely, that book was absolutely a huge influence on me. And a few years later, when I was sort of a preteen, and Time Bandits came out, the Terry Gilliam picture, which I absolutely loved.
Yes. I love that one.
Got the screenplay and making of book of Time Bandits, and that sort of taught me how to write a screenplay. I tried to make a feature film when I was 12 on film, actually, and that's to this day I can't drive. I don't drive, even though that's going to change, because in the years when all the kids were spending their money taking driving lessons or buying cars and things like that, I spent my money on film, and would always concentrate on that. And then afterwards, it was financial issues, really, because when you start off doing this stuff, and also, I had great conflicts with my father, big conflicts. So when I was 17, it was sort of a question of, I'm going to go and make movies. I'm going to go to Montreal on the Quebec side of Canada, and there's nothing you can do about it. So it was sort of a pretty intense time. So I was really, really broke and basically homeless for a few years, and crashing on people's couches and doing odd jobs to scrape by. But like, I never got a high school diploma. I never went to film school, which my critics would say shows in my work. I have zero formal education. Like, not even, like, I couldn't get a job probably at Subway. And when you're passionate about something, there's no greater education than obsession.
True. I'm surprised about the children's book about making the Hammer horror movie. That's just the concept of having such a book wouldn't have occurred to me, particularly for a horror movie.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny, when I was, I was wondering, because the book was impossible to find afterwards and years later, was this some sort of childhood fantasy or delusion? Did I dream this? did I dream this book up? And I recently tracked it down, and indeed it exists, and indeed it is a children's book about the making of To the Devil a Daughter. So, go figure.
I mean, there's a CGI animated Pixar style Cthulhu or Lovecraft film. So,
yeah, for sure. Anything is possible. But To the Devil a Daughter is a particular flavor of picture. So,
yeah, that makes it even weirder that they would have done a children's book about 100%,
that. Right? Like, of all the Hammer or the Universal things to choose, like that.
Yeah, it was great. I'm glad they did. I learned a lot about filmmaking just from that book.
Out of curiosity, was it a gift from your mother or grandmother?
No, it was the public library. They just had it in the public library, and we would go to the public library a lot. We were big avid readers, so even all those Stephen King books and stuff would come from the public library, Edgar Allan Poe.
So you brought up 3 things I'd like to ask a little more information on. Going in the order that you mentioned them, not particularly of starting with this, but sadism. Like, you mentioned that, like, you particularly called it out. What's
sadism is fun.
Well, I mean, what it is it was a sort of shock at first of any sort of depiction. I mean, it's I believe it's Bela Lugosi filleting Boris Karloff, or the other way around. But I think it's Karloff that's attached. And Lugosi's tearing his skin off, and it's all off screen, but it's implied. And that sadism to me was very shocking, and showed you that, and obviously later on I saw the Herschel Gordon Lewis movies, the Mario Bava early stuff, and then I got very heavy into giallos and things like that. So that, and obviously the 80s slasher pictures, which were coming out as I was a youngster. So, like that kind of stuff opened up that it wasn't just about monsters and, that kind of thing, that there was another side of the horror genre that could be potent, whereas the human being is the worst monster of them all, which is something that I believe in greatly. And in that way, it's not about enjoying the sadism. I'm not somebody who gets perverse pleasure from watching people or things suffer, but I enjoy movies that confront truth and dark truths. The best genre pictures are not depicting these things and saying this is a good thing. They're being honest to the horror of what is being presented. So I don't get a sadistic thrill out of it. I see the stuff as being a potent commentary on sort of the human condition.
Mm-hmm. That's why I was kind of struggling to find out how I could ask the question, because there were just the word sadism left a lot of gray matter or gray area that, were we talking about like sexual sadism, or like you say, flaying is a different thing. And then there's the whole concept of whether or not you're promoting this or against it. Like there was all these different directions the conversation could go into. Yeah. And I'm like, how do I phrase this?
For the record, I am against hurting anything or anyone. I think that is bad. Obviously. And again, these elements, are there and placed in films as critiques, I think, than the best pictures of what they're portraying. They're not advocates for it. Of course, people could sort of read stuff in any way they want, but I think when portraying extreme graphic elements in a film, it's usually to portray the horror of it, the genuine horror of it, and not saying this is great. No, it's terrible.
What about surrealism? You had mentioned that as well.
I love it. Definitely, as I was sort of an early teen, I discovered through the bootleg VHS market the films Alejandro Jodorowsky, El Topo, The Holy Mountain. And then when I was a teen, Santa Sangre came out in the cinema, and I would go see it rather obsessively. Like those particular pictures were a big gateway drug into surrealistic films. And of course, I was a big fan of Luis Buñuel, Chandelier, a lot of the Buñuel pictures that came afterwards, and then got into some of the more 60s psychedelia stuff, Kenneth Anger, all those pictures. So, and all this stuff was done on the sort of underground VHS bootleg world. And certainly as a teen, music was an absolutely massive influence. Bands like Psychic TV, Coil, Skinny Puppy, the industrial music was coming in, and that was a part of it. And whereas, these works of art that would test boundaries of what was accepted, subversion was sort of the beginning of the conversation. Those particular works of art were a huge influence on me, and particularly for my first movie that took a number of years to get made. But I started as an adolescent. I started a movie called Subconscious Cruelty when I was 19 years old. Certainly, if I would have gone to college or any of those things, that wouldn't have even been on the table. But because I went sort of the underground route and met just the right people, namely the right person, Mitch Davis, who's now one of the main people in charge of the Fantasia Film Festival in Montreal now, which I worked for as well for a number of years. After meeting Mitch, it was sort of like meeting a member of the family, and to this day, Mitch is a member of the family, and it was great to meet like-minded genre fans.
You also mentioned identifying with monsters.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of identifying with the monsters, the Godzillas, the King Kongs, the, Creature from the Black Lagoon, all that. I mean, I think that came from just feeling different and feeling, because of sort of my name, my background and everything. And also the dynamic of the family, which was quite different from a lot of the other kids I knew over there. You were always going to be different, and it was just a different sort of world from the kids I would go to school with.
When you say family dynamics, are you talking about like your father being very conservative and your mother and grandmother being more liberal?
Yeah, sure, all of it. Race, political views, all those things. It wasn't like this awful upbringing or whatever. No, it was fine. It wasn't anything dramatic in that sense. I was probably the creator of the most drama in that family from my, rebellion. But obviously my mother is wonderful, and my father did his best, of course, within what the world he knew and what he thought would be a safe environment to sort of have his child or children grow up in. I mean, he was never mean spirited in the things he did. He just thought he was just confused. He just didn't know how to deal with it. So I don't blame him. It was never violence or anything. But it's just that it wasn't for me. I hated conformity. Right. I hated all that, so.
I'm guessing you weren't scared by horror at the time. What was the emotion that you felt when you watched those?
Well, I mean, I think the scare is good and never goes away. And no, I mean, I was scared and I enjoyed it. Not in a bad way, though, in a thrilling way, in an educational way. It's like when I saw the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the first time, it was like this incredible revelation. It was incredibly scary and grounded in reality. Again, the basis of the human being is the worst monster of them all. And also it was a tremendous lesson in film editing and cinematography, just in terms of camera angles and almost subliminal edits that aren't necessarily done on speed, but done on movement.
So many tight close-ups of eyeballs.
Absolutely, which is something that I continue to do a lot, even today.
Right.
Which is something.
Thank you, Toby Hooper, for breaking that boundary.
And Romero's movies as well. Romero's early pictures just were tremendous lessons in editing. And, just those VHS lessons, because you could pause it and you could step forward and see actually how the editing was done. Which is something I would do. I would re-edit the movies in certain ways just to try different things with 2 VCRs. I would re-edit them, just to see if you did this instead of that, what would happen.
That is interesting. I've heard of some indie electronic IDM artists, Venetian Snares, for example. He one of the first things he did was to make mashups of things by taking 2 cassette decks and recording them both into a third cassette deck. So you kind of did the video version of that.
Yeah, with terrible VCRs that didn't even have what they called a flying erase head back then. So there was a rainbow sort of on the VHS on every cut, a brief sort of digital analog noise rainbow. It was all analog.
Well, that just gives it that much more
flavor.
Yeah, no, definitely. Today, there would be an app for it, but back then it was considered to be it was considered to be a fault. Today it is a hipster app. So
yes. VHS
correct.
filter.
Yeah. Setting aside the cinematographical aspects of it for a moment, and
is that a word?
I made it up. Shut up. Setting that aside for a second and just focusing on, the initial times that you were watching these horror movies before you maybe had made that decision, which I guess might be hard if you'd made that decision at 6. But I'm just thinking about the thrill aspect of it. I'm wondering what was thrilling to you about it.
Well, it was a rush that was safe. You could be on this journey. You could confront death without having any actual physical or genuine psychological harm towards you. It was a way of confronting the extremes of the human experience in a safe environment. It still is, there's catharsis, a huge element of catharsis involved by going, of course, as you get older, watching more and more extreme films, particularly if they're smart and actually have a reason behind them. And it's not just sadism for sadism's sake, which again isn't my thing. That is in a sort of safe element to reflect and to ruminate on the human being. That's always what it's been about for me.
Do you happen to remember anything specific, like specific scenes that thrilled you?
Yeah, the Universal horror movies I never thought were scary per se. But
actually, I'm sorry, you did answer that one. That was the one where you're talking about the guy got flayed.
Yeah, no, that definitely. And it was just sort of like, wow, I can't believe that they did this, But I was watching really extreme genre pictures early on, just through VHS bootleg stuff. And it was the beginning of VHS sell through, when it was sort of affordable to buy things. Like my first tape of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was an LP speed tape. It was like a budget from, I think, Video Treasures was the name of the label. Cannibal Holocaust, I got in quite young.
How did you find out about this stuff?
I found out about them through genre magazines, and like Gore Zone had a lot of tips in it. Certainly, as to things. Also, a really influential book for me that I got quite young was Phil Hardy's Encyclopedia of Horror, which is a British book that really has a lot of world horror in it. The reviews themselves are pretty snarky and not particularly great, I would say. But the actual sort of technical information in them is, at that time was completely, they talked about Coffin Joe back then, and nobody talked about Coffin Joe. And rare magazines, it was the time when everything came through fanzines, magazines, things like that. So,
did you get those at the library?
No, it was all mail ordering. Fangoria was sort of Famous Monsters first, and then Fangoria were the gateway magazines, and then you would sort of get into a deeper thing.
I guess what I'm trying to get at, I'm missing. There was mail order stuff.
Yep.
But you didn't initially find it at the library, so how did you find it at all?
Fangoria. Yeah, there was always the back ads in Fangoria.
Was Fangoria at the library?
Or no, did you get it, like, magazine stands. Magazine stands. Regular magazine stands. You could get Fangoria. Right.
I'm just trying to understand, because at the ages that you're talking about getting this stuff, even if I'm thinking to myself, even as a parent, if I was allowing horror movies and stuff like that, I was just trying to confirm that, like, did they know that you were mail ordering this stuff, or you just didn't?
Yeah, I mean, like I would watch things like Cannibal Holocaust when I was like, 12. I wasn't 6, watching those movies. In fact, when I was 6, the movie I don't think had come out. But like I was like a preteen or an early teen when I was getting into the really extreme level horror movies.
That was my other question I was going to ask, because you mentioned Texas Chainsaw and Cannibal Holocaust, and I was going to say, how old were you when you saw those?
Yeah, it was probably around that time. Probably
12, 14?
Before 14, but, probably around 12-ish.
I'm going to use that as an excuse for when I can show my nephew Texas Chainsaw and Holocaust. 12 to 14.
Go for it. And then I don't remember the exact age. I saw it maybe a little bit later than that, but maybe not. Suspiria was finally released uncut by Magnum Home Video, which was Bill Lustig, an early itineration of Bill Lustig's, and it was like uncut on VHS letterboxed, and that was a complete life-changing revelation. I was so obsessed with that videotape, which I no longer have. Sadly, it got lost in the shuffle over the years.
That was Suspiria, you said?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that was a huge.
What was so influential about that?
Color, cinematography, music, intensity, use of close-ups, dreaminess.
Yep. All these things.
Performance, everything. Yeah. Everything.
Halloween as a child.
Yeah, great. Love it. Halloween was actually Halloween, the Carpenter film, and also the Holiday. Both were huge deals.
Yeah, we're talking about Holiday.
The Holiday was massive. Still is my favorite holiday, even though I get to celebrate it less and less, because frequently I'm shooting a movie or something during it, and it's not the easiest thing in the world to.
Favorite costume?
Costume? I mean, I loved gore effects and zombies. I was a huge Dawn of the Dead kid. I saw that again. I saw that young, and obviously Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, then later Day of the Dead were absolute life-changing things.
Did you have a least favorite costume?
Any costume was a good costume, I would say. I don't have any memories of a Halloween costume and it was like, this was a terrible idea. Any of them were good,
Okay. Was it the process of dressing up or putting on makeup that you liked, or was it just
Going out and scaring people. Going out and scaring people. It was a way to sort of test the boundaries that affected me so much in these genre pictures. Not in a malicious way whatsoever, but in a sort of like almost trying to share the fun, even though not everybody thought it was fun. As you can
if
imagine,
only they understood, they would share the fun.
Yeah, the whole like, boo, my face is falling off fun, is something that not everybody understands, but those who understand, and there you go.
Did you have any scary dreams as a child? Reoccurring nightmares type of thing?
Not really reoccurring stuff. I mean, I think every kid and every adult has scary dreams. They're mostly insecurity dreams, like everybody. There wasn't anything, I mean, a lot of surreal, strange dreams that back when I was writing ended up as concrete elements of things I was writing. Absolutely.
Anything happened in your childhood in the real world that scared you or introduced any fears?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that happen. I mean, one of the I'm a vegetarian, and one of the things that helped make me not only an atheist but also, somebody who wasn't so down with organized religion, or definitely a vegetarian, was when I was a kid. We went in upstate New York, where I had an uncle who lived there, an uncle on my father's side, and they would celebrate Eid. Eid, of course, a very huge Muslim celebration. And a part of that would be to, I suppose, the halal kill a goat. And of course, these animals we would play with, we would have good times with, we'd love these animals. And of course, we played with this goat. Goats are really nice animals, and then this, my friend,
no idea what was coming,
that we were playing with, then somebody goes and just slits this animal's throat, and of course in front of us, and of course blood flies, and it went and landed on my little nice, formal religious, whatever, dress up nice kids, this white shirt, which is again another lesson, never wear white, and blood went and flew on this shirt, and this poor animal that we loved was killed right in front of us. And then, to make it worse, I don't know quite what the justification of this would be. Maybe again it's that weird sort of sadistic thrill that some people get, which is disturbing, and in my opinion, not a good thing. When doing this kind of thing, he took out the esophagus of the goat and put it sideways and started to clamp it open and shut as if it's a puppet for the children, and made a little sort of funny noise with it. And that's when I thought, okay, maybe this whole Eid thing isn't for me. And the whole act of eating meat isn't for me. And that was influential for sure, because I saw real genuine horror, and I'll never forget the sound of that poor defenseless animal that it made when it was getting killed. Taught me a lot about what people will do in the name of religion. That's the tip of the iceberg. People do way, 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 way worse things in the name of religion, definitely. But it's a start, isn't it?
Yeah. That's a good one. For certain definitions.
Yeah, you can't see it because this is audio only, but when you were describing him puppeting the esophagus, I was just sitting there gape-mouthed and blinking for like a good 30 seconds.
Yeah. No, that was a pretty big eye-opener when I said, this isn't for me, and this is not good. So, it's not only kill this animal, but humiliate its corpse. Nah, not a good thing.
Yeah, that last part was kind of surprising to me too. I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, and I was quite young when that happened.
Yeah, understandable. And I can also see how that ties in with a number of the things that we've already talked about. So yeah,
sure, that was an early sort of tick the box of, not everybody is nice, are they?
Although, on the flip side of that, I've also always, how can I say this? I've always understood that, historically speaking, we as humans have always been, or had always been up until the Industrial Revolution, much closer to the production of our food, in such that people knew where their food was coming from, and they were involved in the slaughtering of animals and all that kind of thing. And that is one part of the beginning of religion, is how do you reconcile the psychological pain of understanding, at least back then when you didn't have a lot of other options, the necessity to kill to eat.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And that, I'm not a moralist either. Like, I get it. I know why. I think today.
Right. But there's still a difference between doing that and making an esophagus puppet.
Correct. Like there's ways of doing it in the most, I don't know, respectful, humane, at least, humane. But what is humane if we say the human being is the worst monster? Yes. Exactly. Really? So, I mean, it's not my thing, but I get it. Like, right. I'm not going to be a moralist about people eating meat or anything like that. Far from it. But, I think that, our primary concern, not only just moral in terms of, the horror that perpetrates and creates. I've seen slaughterhouses. I've seen all that stuff. Is also there's environmental concerns involved with that too. That are certainly pertinent.
Yeah,
that's another story, kids.
Yeah,
but
it's a different podcast.
But definitely seeing that horror taught me, meat ain't my thing.
Yeah. Wow. So that was all just childhood.
Yeah,
Yes.
fun.
So what was left for there to be in teenage years?
There's a lot. There's a lot of stuff out there.
What scary stories or books or movies influenced you as a teen?
Well, I mean, pretty much all what we had discussed already. I was really big on the Italian horror films. Jodorowsky was a big deal. Mario Bava d'Argento, Lucio Fulci, Sergio Martino. Those were all heroes of mine as a teen. The 70s Vietnam American horror movies, Tobe Hooper stuff, George Romero, so many of these indie 70s movies, the big 70s, good studio pictures, The Exorcist, you name it, of that era, were big influences, obviously. And then, as a teenager, certainly David Cronenberg was an absolutely huge influence on me, and David Lynch as well. Both of their works were massive for me. I mean, David Cronenberg, being a Canadian, was a hero to us all and continues to be to this day. And also is just a great human being and has, wonderful family. Now that I work with them, they're absolutely great people.
I was going to say, what was that like to have, Cronenberg as an influence as a kid growing up, and now you get to work with him?
I mean, it's great. And, there's definitely a generational difference, but, even David is now in his, heading towards late 70s, and he, is doing another movie, and it's a subversive movie, and it's a pretty extreme one. And, we have a lot of just professional, through Brandon, who's a very close friend of mine and who I work with. We talk tech, which is fun because the technology's changed a lot since. And, we certainly borrow his tripod an awful lot, which is pretty fun. But, it just sort of comes full circle, and beyond just the whole fame thing and all that, it just shows you when you're a filmmaker, we all just have the same problems, and we're all just a bunch of bums desperate to try to get movies done. And you could have this tremendous body of work and be renowned globally, but we all have the same problems. So, although I'm not, I rarely speak to him directly, just a simple fact that we're all having, and particularly we're mounting two films at the same time. They're going to be shot sort of in timing back to back. So that creates a lot of professional sort of just challenges for everybody.
Yeah. I mean, it takes a lot of equipment, and you don't keep it all in your back pocket. So
No, equipment, but also just politics, casting, things like that. Yeah. So it's all the same problem. So, like I had the chance to meet George Romero a couple times because he was living in Toronto. And it's all the same thing. And I have a lot of colleagues that worked on Romero's later movies. Same thing. We just all had the same problems and continue to have the same problems, those of us who are still with us. So.
Yeah. Chris might be more familiar with this, but I'm not. You mentioned 70s Vietnamese horror?
Vietnam era horror.
Oh, okay.
So all of the angry, anti-Vietnam things, Night of the Living Dead,
right.
Texas Chainsaw, the political stuff, Death Dream, all those.
I thought you were saying stuff that came out of Vietnam. I was like,
no. But later on, there's some Vietnamese horror, particularly in the last little while, that's interesting.
We know, well, let me ask it a different way. Were there any movies or books or stories that you came across in your teens that actually scared you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, even mainstream stuff like Silence of the Lambs, I think, is a very scary movie, and a lot of great stuff. And even something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is not scary per se. It's more political commentary, but I thought that was a really smart movie. And that's a very anti-Vietnam movie. Vietnam War about, what do you do with the veterans? What do you do with Reaganism? Is very much against Reaganism and the whole commerce over everything else. Big business, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is a very anti-big business movie, even with its sort of satirical humorous bent. So I wasn't blind to those things either when I was a kid. I definitely saw their leftist influences, which I share.
By the teen years, had you already encountered other people who were into horror at that point?
Yeah. I mean, definitely not. Certainly, in terms of people I knew physically, not as much in person until later teen years. But certainly in terms of correspondence, I was corresponding with even some horror fans around the world. Corresponding with people like Chaz Ballin, where I would buy videotapes from him, VHS stuff. Yes, it was all illegal in bootlegs, but that's what people did. It was your only access to it. I remember Barry Kaufman from Videomania, also somebody we would, sort of buy movies from. I got a lot of stuff from him as well. These were all underground bootleg. Donald Farmer would also sell VHS bootlegs. Video Search of Miami was another VHS. So all those things were sort of a way in. And then later, particularly one year when I went to the predecessor of what was a fantastic film festival in Montreal prior to Fantasia existing, which the first edition of Fantasia was in 1996. But the first real international edition of Fantasia, where guests with foreign movies and everything, came in 1997, and I was one of the programmers of that festival at that time. But prior to that, in 1992, there was a genre festival that lasted 2 years in Montreal, and I took a bus alone, not really knowing where I would stay or what I would be doing, to this genre festival. I think I was 17 or whatever, I don't know. And I met Mitch Davis and a whole group of friends that are still friends to this day. People like Pat Tremblay, who also has directed some underground genre pictures and stuff like that. And a lot of the core Subconscious Cruelty team I met at that time. CJ Goldman, who was a great friend and also a great special makeup artist for a number of years, who's retired from the business now. But these people, that's when I first met, okay, this is the family. These are the people that I belong with. So within a year, I had moved to Montreal just like that. Was working for Greenpeace, actually going door to door to try and pay my paltry rent. Back then, you could get cheap rents in Montreal. And I was sharing, sort of, I rented a living room in this sort of dump where a lot of people were junkies surrounding us. It was the early 90s, right? So there was an awful lot of heroin. And we saw a lot of that and a lot of extremes of behavior just from that, because it was like literally trying to make movies in the middle of train spotting. So everybody was a junkie around, except I wasn't, because I just had this obsession with cinema. That's probably what saved my life, in that way. I wouldn't even drink. I wouldn't even smoke joints. I was like full on straight edge back then, because it was the only way to get these movies done. I was the only one who could get it together because everybody was stoned. And that was sort of like my sort of mid to late teen years, being around then and making Super 8 sort of underground movies within then. And then at one point with Mitch, we were able to gather together some cash to and Mitch, was able to get things done. And we just started Subconscious Cruelty, but it wasn't, and this was all on film back then. This is not like, it's a lot easier today to do an underground genre picture. Back then, this was on 16 millimeter film. You had to get the equipment, you had to process it, you had to print a work print, you had to cut it on film, you cut it on the same big machine stuff that everybody else had. So it was a very, very different machine back then in order to make a movie. Yeah. So yeah, that was done. That one was done on 16 millimeter, then ultimately blown up to 35 millimeter for its festival release and theatrical exhibition.
Yeah, digital photography and film has really changed the world.
Oh, 100%. It's changed everything.
Yeah. The things that we talked about influencing you in your childhood in terms of, subversion and rebellion and confronting dark truths. Did any of that change in your teen years or underscore it, like highlight it? Or
I mean, no, my teen years were just all about that.
Right, that's what it sounded like.
And certainly my early 20s were about that too. The shock and everything. It was almost like just being a carnival barker. Like, how extreme can you do something to get a reaction? But that was the 90s too. Like, that kind of thing was sort of what people expected from counterculture and underground stuff, and was encouraged. Whereas today, it's quite the opposite. So that was a byproduct of its era. Like that first movie I did, Subconscious Cruelty, was 100% a byproduct of its era and was my teen years. It's basically a scrapbook of my teenage obsessions, which today, is absolutely not who I am. But I respect it and I don't deny it because that was just a product of its era.
Right. Yeah. This might be a good time to bring up something that didn't get brought up in a previous call that we had. I think it was with Scott Shermer. He was talking about how horror changes over decades. I remember reading somewhere something that I thought was very true, which was you can kind of gauge in large part where a society is and what's important to society as a whole by looking at what kind of horror is being made, because what winds up happening is, okay, you've got something that's terrifying to a society at this stage, and then maybe 10 years later you get over that and you realize that there was nothing to be afraid of there. So now you make spoofs of those movies, and maybe another 10 years past that, now you're kind of nostalgic about the thing that you used to be afraid of or making fun of it. And so now you get the throwback stuff.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. It's the cycles of nostalgia, right? It's that's what comes through, and horror movies are absolutely a mirror of the politics and social concerns of the current time, and always have been, and always will be, I believe. And that's why what was shocking and subversive and whatever 90s stuff is now just seen as sort of like kind of hilariously naive in a sense, and what was considered to be incredibly shocking in the 60s is not at all.
Or what we were worried was going to happen hasn't come to pass and probably never will. So maybe a good segue into what kinds of things in the horror genre have scared you as an adult.
Same stuff, I mean, I know a good amount of the tricks, the technical tricks, in terms of films that happen. So that's a little, I think I'll get affected more just by the jump scare factor these days, in terms of, if you want to see me jump in a seat, all right, and I know what's coming, like I know the tricks and everything, but at the same time I can still enjoy it. If I fight it, what's the point? Because I still want to have a good time. I'm still a horror fan, I want to enjoy the thing. So I'm not anti that kind of thing at all. Even though, yes, it's done excessively, like a lot of things, but I get it. There's also commercial reasons why people do that kind of thing. What scares me is, again, the more you get older, the more you have people in your lives that are close to your lives. So it's more just the loss of loved ones is for me the most frightening thing.
Not uncommon.
No, that's it. I think confronting a lot of those fears early on, toughen you up. My parents, to their credit, were in no way interested in sheltering me or protecting me from things. They were sort of like, deal with it, kid, like most of the 70s and 80s parents were. And it sort of toughened me up to a lot of stuff. I mean, I saw a lot of pretty extreme things, and certainly within my teen years, I saw many, many more extreme things, particularly being in that environment of a lot of drug addicts and things like that. It's made me a little bit less easily impressionable towards some of those elements of life. But it taught me what's important, and protect those you love.
Yeah,
that's important.
Yeah, I mean, there are psychological tools that help us deal with trauma, and as you say, that if you learn them early in life, then the things that could traumatize you later in life might change, but you've already learned the tools to deal with them. So that's the important part.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's one of the values of the horror genre. It can sort of help people in a safe environment be confronted by these things, and at least warm them up a little bit in case something does happen to you in life. In reality, you've already sort of at least contemplated these types of things.
All right.
Yeah, I think that's come up a couple of times as far as the positive aspect of the horror genre is it's prepares you for that sense in real life. Plus, it's also a safe escapist simulation of what would it be like to see this graphic violent thing.
And that's why I'm all for portraying violence as a disturbing, awful thing in films. And when things are desensitized and there's maybe too much CGI placed over the effects, so it feels almost like a cartoon, that I feel is not a great thing. And
yeah, it's counterproductive.
Exactly, and much more not helping the scenario to desensitize towards that level of violence. Whereas, if you portray it as genuinely horrible and upsetting, then I think people will realize this is not something good to have happen in reality.
Right. Has anything happened in your adult life that has introduced any new fears that you didn't have before?
Well, yeah, I mean, just deepening relationships. I have a fiance who I love very much. If anything would happen to her, it would be the most devastating thing ever. I have many great close friends who are incredibly important to me. My family, my mother, all these, it just deepens those fears. That's the main stuff. The rest of it, I think, we'll deal with whatever comes. And most of that stuff you don't have much of a choice on anyways.
True. I think I'm going to skip the rest of the adult questions, get towards some of the end ones. The next two questions are looking back over your entire life, and they're not just about horror. And so speaking in general, the two questions would be, what is your favorite movie, and what movie would you say you've watched more times than any other? And they're maybe the same movie, might be different movies.
It's tough to say. I much like in friendship, I just like to say I have many great friends, and I don't like to signal out one, because that would be a disrespect to all my friendships.
Of course.
It is always hard to narrow down
and same in many things, and the same thing in cinema. I cannot say there's one movie that I love above all others, because there's just too many of them that I love. It's really hard decision to make. I mean, probably one of the movies I've seen the most. So some of the movies I've seen the most: Suspiria, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead. Those I've seen an incredible amount of times. I can't even count the amount of times I've seen those movies, and they're still never boring. And I could still watch a million times. Probably Dario Argento's Opera I've seen an incredible amount of times. I absolutely love that movie.
That's a good one.
Again, I can't count the amount of times I've seen it, or at least visited portions of it.
the reason for those questions are because sometimes they underscore things you've already said, but sometimes they introduce something new that you wouldn't have expected. Like the last person we interviewed said Alice in Wonderland. Like,
sure.
And that brings up this whole other avenue of conversation potentially of, maybe introducing something new.
I'm just a horror nerd. What can I
say? Do you see any common threads about what kind of horror you like? Cannibalism, occult, metaphysical? Again, now we're talking over your entire life.
I like creative, man. I just like movies that push boundaries, that, not only in terms of their content, but also from a technical perspective and also form. Because that's what I do. I am a technician,
right.
So those things are what influence me incredibly. Movies that have a political bent to them, that have an idea behind the extreme imagery they're portraying. For example, movies like Salò, Pasolini film. Salò is an incredibly political movie. It's incredibly graphic, has all of this incredibly disturbing stuff, but is also a brilliant picture that packs a wallop. I mean, Salò is another big one for me. I saw that movie I don't know how many times in the cinema on 35 mil, because there was a print rolling around, an uncut print in Montreal, that as a teenager, they would play just regularly. So a movie like Salò is a huge influence as well, because it's political, because it has ideas, it's criticizing something behind the violence. Videodrome is another great movie that, literally a line in the movie is it has a philosophy, and Videodrome is about plenty of smart, brilliant things in there as well. And that's a huge influence on me also. So, I would say genre pictures that aren't just presenting a superficial presentation of what they want, but have a hidden subtext are the ones that appeal to me the most.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have any idea why it is that you like those things?
I'm just interested in all of the extremes of humanity, and politics are part of it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I kind of felt that one was redundant, but I figured, I'll ask it anyway.
Sure.
Yeah. So now that we've narrowed down, or really in this case, I mean, really just underscored through the whole interview, what it is that you like about horror, the sort of last question is, why horror? Because do you think you'd be able to approach any of these topics in any other subgenre or any other genre? I mean,
it's the sort of thing that it's a cliche, but I didn't choose horror. Horror chose me. It just, the minute I was confronted by these images, that was it. The deal was done. This is what my life will be about. And, I've shot movies outside of the horror genre, but they're not my best movies, and not really the ones that, I feel that comfortable in doing. It was good to do them, but I'm not looking to do really stuff outside of the horror genre. I know that's rare for a cinematographer to say. And I've tried stuff outside of the horror genre, but it's just, it's not really where my full-on passion is. Or, sort of peripheral genres like a dark drama, sure, no problem. Or, a very black dark comedy, okay. But stuff that is sort of outside of a genre universe, it's just, there are other cinematographers who could probably be much happier doing that kind of thing instead of me, and there's plenty of great cinematographers out there.
Right.
It's not worth pointing a camera at if it doesn't have my stuff.
I mean, I've done, some pretty almost disturbing movies that have very little blood in them, but even to this day, the minute there's blood on set, everybody just gets a little peppier and more excited. even on the, just relatively larger scale movies, the minute there's a gore effect or something, it still
lightens
puts a
the mood.
Puts a little spring in people's steps, even though those steps usually end up sticking to the ground with syrup. I mean, either Cara syrup or I gotta strongly recommend the new sorbitol blend of blood that some new people are doing. It definitely is way better than the Cara syrup, but not everybody has gone the way of sorbitol, but it's highly recommended.
Product placement.
Sorbitol, thanks you.
Yes. So if we were to summarize, I guess for you, the things that you love about horror are the confronting the dark truths, but also at the same time the shock part of it, of rebellion and violating boundaries and making people think about that process.
Yeah, I mean that's always a part of it. All of the above. The horror genre is such a wide spectrum. It's not just only about that. It could be about many things. It could be about a sense of melancholy, even a sense of romance, a sense of poetry.
That's true. Just as how you could have death in a rom-com, you can have rom-com in a horror. So, I mean, it's not saying you can't go in the other direction. And you might even say that you kind of have to have some of that, because if you don't get the viewer to invest in the character, then where's the horror when you lose the character? So,
yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, and that's within a certain kind of picture. I mean, there's other, pictures where you should not have sympathy for the lead character, and then it becomes more of a character study, which is also valuable, although maybe considered to be less of a commercial sort of risk at the or less of a commercial decision for box office.
Right.
Those movies have a tremendous amount of value too when you're just with a tremendous anti-hero, so to speak, throughout the whole thing, and are just analyzing the why,
right,
as opposed to just being with somebody who is good and then confronted by something bad.
Yeah, those tend to be a lot more controversial, I think.
Yes, absolutely. But I think controversy is a good thing.
Yeah, no, not disagree.
Yeah. Shakes things up.
All right. Well, I think we got a pretty good summary for you. Before we close the call, did you want to pitch anything again? I can try and remember the things that you mentioned at the start.
No, I mean, it's all good. This has been fun, and it's definitely good to talk about. Let's sort of say the deeper meanings of the genre, and of course, horror means something different to absolutely everybody.
True.
It's all affected to everybody, and everything is about perception. We all perceive things through our individual sort of life tea sieve. Whatever water comes from the top might be the product, but the tea that comes out is individual to all of us. So this is just, sort of my perspective on it. But, I think all perspectives are welcome, and everybody's, contribution to the genre. And particularly what's great about what's going on these days is a lot of people who previously didn't necessarily have voices within the genre are having voices within the genre now. And I think that's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
And I can't wait to see what everybody does. I am, first and foremost, other than a filmmaker, a horror fan. And I'm very excited by a lot of the stuff that's coming out these days.
Yeah, one of the reasons that Chris and I wanted to do this is, as you say, everybody has their own reason for it. And, the mainstream world doesn't necessarily always understand the reasons that people have for enjoying this kind of thing. And we thought this would be an interesting opportunity to talk about those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But what's funny is horror has become incredibly mainstream.
Some of it
these
is,
days.
I know, right?
Yeah, and even some of the most graphic horror movies, like with the advent of streaming services, some incredibly graphic stuff is coming out that is very mainstream, very widely distributed and circulated. So it's kind of a weirdly exciting time for extreme horror, in a sense that it has become tremendously mainstream. I mean, you'll see stuff that never would have gotten an R rating, and in stuff like The Handmaid's Tale, for example, TV shows like that. So it's an interesting time. It's very strange, particularly when you grew up in a time of a lot of censorship, like in the 80s, to see the stuff that never would have passed then, win Emmy Awards. We ain't in Kansas anymore, Toto.
Yeah, on a recent call, I had mentioned, I don't know how familiar you are with comic books, but there was a comic book series in the 80s and 90s called Grendel. And there was a mini series called Grendel Warchild that I absolutely loved and I thought would make an amazing movie. And now I think the world might be ready for it. But prior to the last maybe 10 years, the world wouldn't have been ready for it. And I think the things that really set the foundation, I struggled to remember the second one and the last time I brought it up, but the Dark Knight trilogy and Game of Thrones was the other one that I was trying to think of, because the Grendel Wardchild series has both graphic sex, I think, in it, if I remember correctly, and violence. So
Game of Thrones helped sort of toughen up mainstream genre pictures tremendously, because it was such a successful show and really went places and was really, really, really extreme. Certainly Game of Thrones.
To the point where they were like, hey, you want to smash a guy's head like a watermelon? You know what? The show's popular enough.
You can do it. Yeah. I mean, certainly Possessor was greatly helped to be able to make that movie as extreme as it was. We were helped by, things like Game of Thrones, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, without things like that in the past, like, say, 10 years or so, I'd say it probably would have gotten an NC-17.
Possessor did get an NC-17, actually. and had to be...
Open mouth, insert foot.
Had to be censored by 2 minutes, or changed by 2 minutes. There's two versions of it. Thankfully, the NC-17 version is widely circulated. It's called Possessor.
Yeah, I've only seen the uncut. Exactly. What did they take out?
All the penises, which I suppose you can imagine the irony of that. They cut out, spoiler alert, everybody, the close-ups of the kid's head being blown out at the ending. They cut Andrea Riseborough having a penis. They cut some of the stabs at the beginning of the movie, a considerable amount of them. We had to use an alternate take, actually, for a sequence that featured quite graphic nudity and real sex and things like that. But definitely got an NC-17. The MPAA's list of all of their grievances with it was hilarious. It was like this really long grocery list of things they had a problem with the movie. But thankfully it passed ultimately, and we fulfilled our contractual obligations. And Neon Neon were so cool to still widely release the uncut version. We have absolutely nothing to complain about. We were tremendously lucky and very well served by them. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that interesting too. Like, usually an uncut comes out several months after the initial release. This was just like, it's out, it's uncut.
Yeah, everyone was confused. Everyone was confused as to why it's called uncut. Why is it called uncut? And then they found out afterwards, actually, like, for example, Amazon Prime only plays the R-rated version of Possessor. Yeah, they're only playing the censored version. Go figure.
I think that's where I saw the uncut version.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe a rental. I know in the States when it first came out, it was only the R. They were the only streaming service that said R only, please. And weirdly enough, Walmart would only take an R-rated DVD of it.
It's to be expected.
Redbox and all those things. So there is an R-rated DVD only of Possessor. It's got a red box, ironically. But if you see it with a yellow cover, it's uncut.
Okay.
If you're,
so
curious about that kind of thing.
Yes. Collector's item.
Yeah, I mean, I think the R-rated version is a bit of a collector's item, but it's not one I recommend you really collect.
Go out and get the incomplete one.
It kind of ruins the movie, if you ask me. But what do I know?
Nothing.
Well, it's that's all subjective. I know some people prefer the R version. They prefer to have things more implied, and that's cool for them. I mean, if we finished the R version, we went to the hassle of finishing it. So if people actually watch it and enjoy it, I guess that's their prerogative, and I can't stand against that.
If nothing else, maybe it'll whet their appetite for the more extreme version.
One can hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for being our guest.
Thank you. Pleasure.
And thank you to anybody out there listening. Please do come visit us at horrormakesushappy.com. We've got a list there of people that we'd like to interview. If you know anybody on the list and can put us in touch, please do. If you'd like to have somebody added to the list, let us know. Horrormakesushappy.com.